Okay, so this is a talking point I've done videos about before, and I keep coming back to it because it continues to be relevant. We keep seeing modern politics in fiction, and it continues to make people upset. At the time of making this video, Disney Marvel's Ironheart series has finally been released, and it's getting panned by whatever audience the MCU still has left. This is a series based off a comic book that was never well received to begin with. The character just isn't likable. She's evil, she steals Tony Stark's technology, she demands that her teacher treat her in a racist manner because she wants to feel like a victim, she commits a hostile takeover of a foreign nation, the list goes on. Somehow, she gets even worse in the TV show. And the whole thing feels like it was written in 2022, which it was, and tried to capture the current politics of the time surrounding the BLM movement, which fell out of favor before they released the series. Now, I don't normally like to weigh in on politics on this channel, because I know that half the people who are interested in improving their writing, their world building, and the characters they create don't agree with me on a lot of issues, and my goals with this channel are to see better entertainment, even when it doesn't agree with my personal politics. However, with a topic like this, there is no way to be intellectually honest without exposing some of my own views, and stepping on some people's toes. A straightforward example is the War of the Rohirrim movie that came out a while back, with a focus on a feminist message in a medieval setting. The big problem everyone has with a story like that is that, on some level, everyone knows that feminists aren't interested in equality when it comes to military service. Literally, anyone who has ever had a conversation with a feminist in the last 20 years, or even has just seen their reactions to the Supreme Court potentially addressing the question in the near future, knows that feminists don't want to go to war. That was actually a problem during the 60s, where feminists wanted to keep pushing further even after the Civil Rights Act became law, but when the Vietnam War had escalated to the point where America had started relying on the draft again, and as soon as the feminists realized that if they kept pushing that equality envelope, they might get drafted, a lot of them packed up their signs and went home. The Middle Ages were a time when nations were constantly at war. Women weren't challenging the status quo because the status quo was keeping them alive, and they knew it. People don't like seeing modern feminism in a medieval fantasy setting because we know it wouldn't work. We have too much real-world context for why it wouldn't. But that doesn't mean feminism has no place in fiction. Feminism actually has a fairly long history of popping up, demanding equality, and then retreating into the shadows whenever the subject of extending the negative parts of equality to women comes up. And while the word feminism is new, only around 250 years old, give or take, the concept has been around forever. Greek philosophers in Athens complained about women demanding more and more rights during the height of the Athenian Empire, culminating in a point where Socrates and his students started sitting around asking themselves what they actually needed women for. Since the men had started doing more of their own domestic labor, they had embraced a more free love stance when it came to the bedroom, and the more you read the stuff these philosophers left behind, the more it starts to sound like something that you could hear on a Dude Bro podcast today. You could almost hear Aristotle ask what women bring to the table. Then in ancient Rome, and if you're subscribed to this channel, you knew we were going to Rome at some point, we have Tacitus complaining that the old, motherly women that made Rome great were gone, and replaced with a new generation of women who sound like feminist women today. And Juvenal, the poet, wrote an entire satire that sounds eerily similar to some YouTube videos that you've probably heard before today. There's even some evidence that feminism showed up in some capacity even before the Athenians, although the evidence is less complete because people didn't write enough records back then for us to get a clear picture. This brings me to the first issue with trying to claim that modern politics don't belong in different fictional settings. The problem is, there's nothing modern about a lot of these issues at all. They pop up all throughout history, so long as the conditions are right. Of course, it doesn't make sense to include feminism in a medieval setting, just as it doesn't make sense to include racial conflicts between white people and non-whites in a story set in Europe when non-whites wouldn't be present. But that doesn't mean it's never appropriate to include them. The key is making it believable. For example, in all the historical examples of feminism appearing throughout the ages, there are two things that always have to be present. Without them, feminism simply cannot work. First, women need to feel safe enough from external threats that they're willing to risk joining a movement that drives away competent men that would otherwise protect them. In the case of Rome and Athens, it was always during the height of the empire. In the modern world, you might notice that feminism is more popular in the cities, but not as much in rural communities. That's because clomping around in high heels proclaiming that you don't need men doesn't work if you live in a neighborhood surrounded by bears, which is why you almost never see a movement like this if your society is still agrarian, like it usually is under feudalism. In order for a feminist movement to gain any traction, The women cannot have any physical threats around except for the men themselves. Everything else, from wild animals to rival tribes or barbarians, have to be driven away by the men first. Then, when those men are the only thing left that can pose a threat to women, that's when feminism can move from being an idea held by some wealthier individuals to an actual movement. The other thing you need to have is some way of handling all the heavier manual labor. Basically, the more your society depends on people doing their own direct manual work, the harder it is to get a feminist movement going. I've heard people argue that women had to work on farms in the past throughout history, and there's truth to that, but a lot of times, there were certain jobs that had to be done that most women simply could not do by themselves. Ask any woman who has moved to America from Eastern Europe, and they'll tell you how men actually used to be more valued than women because of how dependent everyone was on muscle power until only recently. In the ancient world, this was where slaves came in. An enslaved male eunuch could be purchased in Rome for about the cost of a car today. What kind of car? Well, what kind of slave were you looking to buy? Same concept. Just as a car today can cost anywhere between $30,000 new or $4,000 used, slave markets work the same way. Today, instead of slavery, we have automation. But you might notice that in both of these cases, the solutions people have cost money. A woman with enough money to throw at her problems doesn't have to do any backbreaking labor, and this is why whenever a movement like this appeared throughout the ages, it always started from the upper classes and sometimes worked its way down to the middle class. Very rarely does feminism ever trickle down to women in the working class, because they just can't afford these solutions and often have to find a husband. And when that becomes crucial to your survival, you can't gamble with things like joining a movement like feminism. There are ways of getting around this in the real world, but they have their own drawbacks as well. And of course, if anything happens that could disrupt these two factors, either the safety of your society or the methods for handling physical labor, the movement falls apart. This is why if you map women's rights throughout history, it would look like the movement of a pendulum. But with this information, we now have a blueprint for how to construct a fictional world where a feminist movement could plug right in. Does your fantasy world have magic that can tackle those two conditions? Do you have a sci-fi world with technology that can handle them? Possible solutions are endless. The key here is that you can insert modern politics into a fictional world as long as it doesn't break the audience's suspension of disbelief. People might not consciously know why the politics don't fit with the story you've made, but their brains will notice when something doesn't add up. Other examples of political issues we can see throughout history are almost uncanny. For example, Rome had massive political conflicts over immigration. A lot of people think barbarians destroyed Rome by attacking it from the outside, but in reality, Rome let a lot of barbarians in as immigrants when their birth rate dropped too low, partly because of the aforementioned Roman version of feminism. The number one reason that the barbarians gave for wanting to move to Rome was, quote, a better life, an actual slogan used at the time. But most of the Germanic peoples who moved to Rome couldn't actually find work because they didn't have the skills they needed to integrate into Rome's economy, so they just ended up going on the dole, which was the Roman version of welfare. And I know people are going to ask, so I've linked sources for these things in the description. Now, it is true the barbarians would eventually sack Rome from the inside, but not until the dole ran out of money, and they started looting the cities from inside Rome's own walls. And that leads me to another issue people throw haphazardly into fictional settings: race relations. And again, there are examples throughout history where different racial groups would be living together in the same nation or empire, but they're almost never the ones that are used by major media. For example, the Middle East in the ancient world was made up of a wide variety of ethnic groups who all viewed themselves as different tribes, all conquered by one empire after another, until the Persians took control, and Persia, in a lot of ways, was rather forward-thinking for the time when it came to interracial relations. Granted, to the outside observer, these people would have all looked the same, and telling them apart would be almost impossible. The thing is, different racial groups don't usually appear in the same area naturally. People tend to adapt to their environments, and it's really rare for two different racial groups to evolve in the same place at the same time. Usually, the only reason you'd have different ethnic groups in the same local region is because of migration, and there has to be a good reason for it, especially in a pre-modern society where transportation technology isn't as good as it is today. Traveling from Africa to Europe used to be an incredibly dangerous journey that would take months. It's not just the lack of advanced boats or cars, you have to have some way of carrying food and water with you over that time, or try to forage while you're traveling, which is also risky. People don't make trips like this to settle in a new land unless there's a good reason. And that's assuming that it was legal. When people are traveling between regions of the same empire, like Persia or Rome, at least there's a way they can do it legally, and the reason for traveling might be rather simple, like a traveling merchant. But traveling between foreign nations that aren't under the same government becomes a problem. Most of the world used to execute people who tried to cross borders illegally. But, like with feminism, there are cases in history we can point to where people could make journeys like this. Once again, it's not usually during the Middle Ages under feudalism. There were no economic migrants during the days when there weren't a lot of economic opportunities or freedom throughout Europe. But during the height of the Roman Empire, that was a different matter. Now, the logistics of going from Africa to Northern Europe would have been almost impossible, to the point where no one would make such a journey because to do it would have been... Now, the logistics of going from Africa to Northern Europe would have been almost impossible, to the point where no one would make such a journey because it wouldn't be worth it. People were more likely to travel to Rome itself, both from Africa and from northern parts of Europe. There's also the issue that when an empire like that starts to fall apart, the people who aren't native to that part of the world tend to make a journey back home if they can. Rome didn't collapse in a day, and nobody wants to be an ethnic minority in a city that's slowly turning into a lawless dumpster fire. Most people would rather be surrounded by folks who look like them when the government collapses. We know that in Rome's case, a lot of the people who were foreign to that part of the world said, "Screw this, I'm out," once the government started running out of money. In fact, that's part of how the Holy Roman Empire got started. People who fled back to their homelands from Rome took the cultural ideas that they had picked up during their time in Rome and started a new civilization built around some of the things that they'd learned. Now, if you want to apply these lessons to a fictional setting, there's ways to make a story like this work and include modern politics around race relations. First, how good is the transportation available in your world? Can people teleport? Are there stable portals people can rely on? Once the technology to cross a continent becomes available, merchants carrying goods to and from different cultures are going to become more common. Port towns are where you always see the most ethnic diversity, because sometimes the merchants set up a permanent shop there and just import goods from suppliers back home. The other way you can get lots of different ethnic groups in the same area is due to conquest. Who exactly is native to each region? Where did everyone come from? Who conquered who? And how? Are some of these people refugees? If so, then where did they come from? What's going on back in their homeland? Generally speaking, with rare exceptions, whichever group of people are the conquerors, they usually either had a higher technology advantage over the people they conquered, or a greater amount of manpower, or an economic edge to keep their armies supplied. Most conquering peoples throughout history had two or more of these things. This naturally means that the people who are conquered are going to have a much lower standard of living than the conquerors, and it also means the conquerors are often going to see themselves as superior to the people that they conquered, not just because they've defeated them in a military manner, but also because of differences in technological advancement, or economic development. If America were to invade a nation that was identical to England in the Dark Ages, we'd likely feel that our society was superior to theirs, due to the fact that their economic system has left most of their people in poverty, their technology is centuries behind ours, and their culture is as undeveloped as their tech. And in a way, we'd be right. It is entirely possible to set up racial tensions similar to what we have in the modern world in a fictional setting, so long as you do the actual work of setting them up. And unfortunately, that's the part that a lot of media today tries to skip. Whether it's because of an agenda they want to push, or laziness, or just plain incompetence when it comes to writing, a lot of books, movies, games, and other media tries to cram modern politics in settings where they just don't work and have no proper setup. A lot of this comes down to the concept of verisimilitude. Verisimilitude in media refers to a story appearing to be real or following real-world logic. In a lot of ways, it overlaps with the uncanny valley. You see, people can accept magic in a fictional setting because we don't have a real-world context for it. It falls on the unknown or abstract end of the uncanny valley, where things don't look too familiar and our brains can accept them without too much difficulty. But having multiple racial groups in the same location when the time period doesn't fit is something that we actually do have a real-world context for. It lands in the uncanny part of the graph, and our brains won't accept it unless there's an explanation. Our brains subconsciously know that a medieval society with multiple ethnic groups mingling together wouldn't exist under normal circumstances. There are plenty of ways to explain it, but you have to actually do the explaining part. One franchise that has historically done a fairly good job with this is the Elder Scrolls. In Morrowind, it is established pretty clearly that the Dunmer are the most openly racist group of people in Tamriel. Elves in this universe actually believe themselves to be descended from their gods, not just created by them like the humans believe. And it's partly because the human races take a more humble approach to their religion that the elves consider themselves their superiors. This comes to a head in Skyrim, with the civil war between the Stormcloaks and the Imperials. There are many fans who believe Ulfric Stormcloak is a Nord supremacist, and that he despises all other races. And not helping his case is the fact that some of his followers, including his direct underlings, really are extremely racist. Making things more complicated is the fact that there's an entire quarter of his capital city, Windhelm, reserved for the Dunmer, called the Grey Quarter, which allegedly is not a nice place to live. And worse, the Argonians aren't even allowed into the city at all, being forced to live outside the city by the docks. But if you know the history of these racial conflicts, which have been built up for several games at this point, you know why Ulfric would set things up this way. First, the Dunmer and Argonians both moved to Windhelm as refugees from the destruction of Morrowind, the ancestral home of the Dunmer. Why are Argonian refugees fleeing to Windhelm from Morrowind? What were they doing in the land of the Dunmer to begin with? Well, the Dunmer had historically conquered and enslaved them. And even centuries later, there were descendants of the Argonian slaves still living in Morrowind. And on top of that, as I previously mentioned, the Dunmer are probably the most racist group of people in Tamriel. So keeping them segregated from the rest of the city might have been to prevent them from picking fights with the other people in the city. And keeping the Argonians in separate housing also makes sense, because there's still bad blood between the two races. And if one of them has to live down by the water, it just makes sense that it'd be the people who get water breathing as a racial trait and are better adapted to water in general. It is highly unlikely that Ulfric is as racist as his more extremist followers, because otherwise, why'd he take refugees from Morrowind in the first place? His real motives for the Civil War likely focus around the fact that the Empire has banned the worship of Talos, and that they've let the Thalmor have free reign to root out and arrest people for worshipping their god in the privacy of their own homes. And on top of it all, we have no evidence that the Grey Quarter is that bad of a place to live, or if it is, that it has anything to do with the policies of Ulfric Stormcloak and the Nords. It could easily be that the Dunmer refugees didn't bring a ton of wealth with them when they came to Skyrim, and they're getting started from nothing, or that their own racism is blocking opportunities to improve their standard of living in a human-majority region. I could compare this to real-world political struggles all day. This is a well-constructed example of a fictional world that examines politics identical to issues we have going on in the real world. This is how it's done. The last issue of modern politics that keeps showing up in fiction, that I want to bring up today, is the struggle between the rich and poor. Thankfully, this is one that I think most people don't have too much issue with. And that's because this is a problem that has existed in some form or another ever since we moved from Stone Age hunter-gatherers where nobody had wealth, to agricultural communities where some people had wealth. Basically, ever since the invention of property rights, people who had property have thought it was awesome, and people who didn't have any property have wanted property rights abolished. And people have told stories about characters struggling with class inequality for centuries. Robin Hood is probably the best example, but let me ask you this. Is Robin Hood stealing from the capitalists to give to the working man? Or is he taking from the government to give back to the taxpayers? I think this is the big problem I have with this one. It's not that I can't wrap my head around class warfare in a fictional setting. It's that I can't believe it's ever as simple as poor people good, rich people bad. Once again, the problem comes down to the creators not putting in the work for the world building to make the message land. Of course, there are other reasons why many political messages in fictional settings don't work out. World building a setting that can actually support your message is only the first step. You also have to deliver that message in a way that actually works. And, perhaps the biggest problem with Ironheart, the message you want to send has to actually be a good one. Seriously, this show would be great if it was supposed to be the origin story of a villain. But that's going to have to be the topic of another video. Maybe the one after the next trope analysis. Let me know in the comments section if there are other modern political issues that show up in fiction, and if you can think of any historical analogs or settings I didn't mention. I intend to do the sci-fi melee weapons video I promised a while back for my next trope analysis, but I'm curious if there are other things people want to see discussed in media and entertainment today, so let me know in the comments section below if there's something you want me to cover. And you can always check out my book series Heroes of Janan over on Amazon. I've finally found a narrator who's working with me on the audiobook, so we'll finally be on Audible soon. And now, today's featured game is New Arc Line, a dieselpunk party-based role-playing game similar to Baldur's Gate. Seriously, it's like if someone made a Baldur's Gate clone but set in a dieselpunk fantasy world. It definitely has its selling points, and I really wanted to like this game, but it has some problems as well. First, the game is still in early access, so there's a lot of stuff that might come out later that hasn't yet. And it shows, because there's a lot that just seems to be missing from an otherwise good game. The setting is fantastic, but it becomes rather jarring when I can't pick between more than two classes, Diesel Engineer and Voodoo Shaman. Why is there no Gunslinger class? Why not a bruiser character type? Well, you can still construct that from the engineer, but it's not going to be the same. And Voodoo Shaman is kind of weird. Why did they pick voodoo as their magic system when the actual gameplay has nothing to do with the actual voodoo religion? Why pick a religion that people in real life actually follow if you're not going to use it at all? Why not just make up a new type of magic with your own imagination? Or just call it something more generic, like sorcery? Do they even have the voodoo religion in this world, or did you just use that name because you thought it sounded good? This is annoying, but it doesn't ruin the whole game for me. I'd give New Arc Line a 7 out of 10 for now, with a wait and see for what comes out later. There's an update scheduled in a week that's supposed to include some new classes and the option to play as a dwarf, and hopefully they work the bugs out over time. Alright, that's all I have for today. Hit that like and subscribe button, and thank you all, and goodbye.